The humid Virginia air clung to Sarah Mitchell's skin as she stepped out of her rental car outside Murphy's Bar, a dive establishment known for attracting military personnel from the nearby Norfolk Naval Base. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting an eerie blue glow across the cracked asphalt parking lot. Sarah adjusted her civilian clothes, a simple black tank top and jeans, feeling almost naked without her uniform. After 18 months of classified operations that she couldn't discuss with anyone, even her own family, she desperately needed a normal evening among regular people. Sarah had requested this shore leave specifically to decompress. The psychological toll of her recent missions in the Horn of Africa had been immense, though officially, she had never been there. As a member of DevGru, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, her very existence in certain operations was classified at levels that made normal social interaction feel like walking through a minefield of potential security breaches. Tonight, she just wanted to be another person grabbing a drink, maybe shooting some pool, and pretending that the weight of national security didn't rest partially on her shoulders. The bar's interior was exactly what she expected, dimly lit, filled with cigarette smoke despite the no-smoking laws, and populated by a mix of sailors, Marines, and local civilians looking for cheap drinks and cheaper thrills. The jukebox played classic rock while several patrons clustered around a pool table in the corner. Sarah made her way to the bar, noting the exits and potential threats out of pure habit. Old instincts died hard, especially when those instincts had kept her alive in situations that would give most people nightmares. "What'll it be?" asked the bartender, a grizzled man in his 50s with navy tattoos covering his forearms. His weathered face suggested someone who had seen his share of bar fights and late-night confessions from homesick servicemen. "Whiskey neat," Sarah replied, settling onto a bar stool. She preferred to keep her alcohol consumption minimal, but tonight she felt entitled to at least one drink. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as it went down, providing a warmth that had nothing to do with the Virginia humidity. As she nursed her drink, Sarah became aware of a commotion near the pool table. A group of Marines, judging by their haircuts and bearing, were engaged in increasingly loud trash talk with some Navy personnel. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that preceded either hearty laughter or flying fists. Sarah had witnessed enough inter-service rivalries to recognize the warning signs. The leader of the Marine group was a large man with the build of someone who lived in the gym when he wasn't training for combat. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had the swagger of someone accustomed to being the toughest person in the room. His voice carried clearly across the bar as he regaled his companions with stories of Marine superiority over squid sailors. His audience of fellow Marines laughed appreciatively while shooting challenging glances at the Navy table. "I'm telling you guys," Rodriguez declared loudly enough for half the bar to hear, "Marines are the real warriors. These Navy boys spend all their time polishing decks and playing with their little boats. When the real fighting starts, they call us to handle business." Sarah rolled her eyes and signaled for another whiskey. She had heard variations of this argument countless times throughout her military career. Inter-service rivalry was as old as the military itself, usually harmless but occasionally escalating into genuine hostility. Most of the time, it was just frustrated testosterone and unit pride, but alcohol had a way of amplifying everything. The Navy sailors at the adjacent table were clearly growing agitated. One of them, a petty officer with the lean build of someone who spent time running rather than lifting weights, finally spoke up. "Maybe you Marines should try learning to read before you talk about who's tougher," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Rodriguez's response was immediate and aggressive. He stood up to his full height, easily 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and attitude. "What did you say, sailor boy? You want to repeat that where I can hear it better?" The confrontation was escalating quickly, and Sarah could see other patrons beginning to take notice. The bartender was already reaching for what she assumed was either a phone to call the shore patrol or a baseball bat to handle things personally. This was exactly the kind of situation she had hoped to avoid tonight. "Look, we're all on the same side here," the petty officer said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "No need to get worked up over nothing." "Nothing." Rodriguez stepped closer, his face flushing red with anger and alcohol. "You just insulted the entire Marine Corps, and you think that's nothing? Maybe it's time someone taught you squid boys some respect. Sarah finished her second whiskey and was about to leave when she noticed something that made her pause. At a table near the back of the bar, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 21 was surrounded by three men who were clearly making her uncomfortable. The woman kept trying to edge away from them, but they moved closer every time she did. One of them had his hand on her arm, despite her obvious attempts to pull away. The situation was developing on two fronts now: the brewing fight between the Marines and sailors, and what appeared to be a potential assault in the back corner. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She assessed both situations, calculating distances, escape routes, and potential weapons of opportunity. The woman in the corner was in immediate danger, while the military personnel were still in the posturing phase of their confrontation. Sarah made her decision. She stood up and walked toward the back table, her movement purposeful but not aggressive. She had learned long ago that confident body language often prevented situations from escalating better than any weapon. "Hey, Jessica," she called out to the cornered woman, using a random name but speaking as though they were old friends. "I've been looking all over for you. Our table is ready." The relief on the young woman's face was immediate and obvious. "Oh, hi. These guys were just leaving." The three men turned to look at Sarah with expressions ranging from annoyed to predatory. The largest one, a civilian with the soft build of someone who spent more time at bars than gyms, clearly wasn't interested in giving up easily. "Actually, we were just getting to know Jennifer here," he said, deliberately using the wrong name to show he had been listening to Sarah's approach. "Why don't you find your own table, sweetheart?" Sarah's smile never wavered, but something in her eyes changed. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. My friend wants to leave now." "Your friend can speak for herself," another man interjected. He was smaller than his companion, but had the aggressive demeanor of someone trying to prove something. "Besides, we bought her drinks. She owes us some conversation at least." "Nobody owes you anything," Sarah said quietly. Her voice carried clearly despite its low volume, and something in her tone made all three men take notice. "She's leaving. You're going to let her go." The largest man laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it if we don't?" "Call for help." Sarah stepped closer, positioning herself between the men and the young woman. "I won't need to call for help." Meanwhile, the confrontation between the Marines and sailors had reached a boiling point. Rodriguez had moved within arm's reach of the petty officer, and his companions were forming a loose circle around the Navy personnel. The bartender was on the phone, probably calling the shore patrol, but they wouldn't arrive in time to prevent whatever was about to happen. "You squid boys think you're so smart with your fancy electronics and your air conditioning," Rodriguez sneered. "But when it comes to real fighting, you fall apart. I've seen it in Afghanistan, Iraq, all over the place. Marines do the heavy lifting while you play with your computers." The petty officer had clearly reached his limit. "You know what, Jarhead? I'm getting real tired of your mouth. Maybe it's time someone shut it for you." The first shove came from one of Rodriguez's companions, a younger Marine who had been drinking steadily all evening. He pushed one of the sailors hard enough to send him stumbling backward into another table. The sailor recovered quickly and swung back, connecting with the Marine's jaw with a satisfying crack. That was all the provocation needed for the situation to explode into chaos. Within seconds, all the Marines and sailors were engaged in a free-for-all brawl that quickly spread to involve other patrons. Chairs flew, bottles shattered, and the jukebox cut out mid-song as someone was thrown into it. Sarah heard the commotion behind her, but kept her focus on the immediate threat. The three men harassing the young woman had become more aggressive as the bar fight provided cover for their behavior. "Look, lady, you need to mind your own business," the largest man said, reaching out to grab Sarah's arm. "This doesn't concern you." That was his first mistake. Sarah caught his wrist in a grip that made him wince and applied just enough pressure to let him know she was serious. "Take your hands off me." His second mistake was trying to escalate. Instead of backing down, he attempted to grab her with his other hand while his companions moved to flank her. Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. She twisted his captured wrist in a direction it wasn't designed to go while driving her knee into his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping for air, and she used his momentum to send him crashing into his friends. Jennifer, go, Sarah said without taking her eyes off the three men. The young woman didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door at a near run. The two remaining men looked at their wheezing companion and then at Sarah with new respect and growing anger. You crazy bitch, one of them snarled. You just made a big mistake. Behind them, the bar fight was reaching epic proportions. Rodriguez had gotten hold of a pool cue and was using it like a staff, keeping multiple sailors at bay while his fellow Marines battled around overturned tables. The bartender had given up trying to restore order and was instead focused on protecting his more expensive bottles of liquor. Sarah backed toward the wall, giving herself room to maneuver and ensuring no one could get behind her. The two men approached more cautiously now, having seen what happened to their friend. She could tell they were trying to decide whether their injured pride was worth potentially serious physical harm. Just walk away, she told them. Your friend will be fine in a few minutes, and you can all go somewhere else to drink. No way, the smaller man said. He had pulled out a knife, a short blade that looked more like a utility tool than a weapon, but was dangerous nonetheless. You want to play tough guy? Let's see how tough you really are. Sarah's training took over completely. She had faced armed opponents in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and a drunk civilian with a pocket knife wasn't even close to the most threatening situation she had encountered. Still, she preferred to end confrontations quickly and with minimal injury to all parties involved. The man with the knife lunged forward clumsily, his movements telegraphed by alcohol and adrenaline. Sarah sidestepped easily, caught his wrist, and applied a joint lock that forced him to drop the weapon. A quick strike to a pressure point on his neck sent him to the floor, unconscious but breathing normally. His companion looked at his two fallen friends, and then at Sarah with a mixture of fear and calculation. She could see him trying to decide whether to cut his losses or attempt to salvage some dignity from the situation. Unfortunately, he chose poorly. Instead of retreating, he charged at her with his fists swinging wildly. Sarah deflected his punches effortlessly and responded with a precise strike to his carotid artery. He joined his friend on the floor, and Sarah stepped back to assess the situation. The bar fight was beginning to wind down as participants either realized they had forgotten what they were fighting about or simply ran out of energy. Rodriguez was still standing, though he was bleeding from a cut above his eye and his shirt was torn. Several other Marines and sailors were picking themselves up off the floor, and the bartender was surveying the damage to his establishment with a resigned expression. It was then that Rodriguez noticed Sarah standing over the three unconscious civilians. In his alcohol and adrenaline-fueled state, he completely misread the situation. All he saw was a woman who appeared to have been involved in some kind of fight, and his Marine instincts told him to intervene. Hey, he called out, pointing at Sarah. What the hell happened over there? Sarah looked at him calmly. These men were harassing a young woman. I helped her leave. Rodriguez's vision was somewhat blurred from the fighting and drinking, and he was operating on pure aggression at this point. He saw three men on the floor and a woman standing over them, and in his current state, he jumped to the wrong conclusion. Bullshit, he snarled, stalking toward her. I know what I'm seeing here. You probably set those guys up, got them drunk, and then your friends robbed them or something. Sarah held up her hands in a peaceful gesture. That's not what happened. These men were threatening someone, and I intervened. That's all. But Rodriguez was beyond reason at this point. The combination of alcohol, adrenaline, and his already aggressive mindset had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. He had been looking for a fight all evening, and now he thought he had found a legitimate target. You lying bitch, he spat, moving close enough that Sarah could smell the whiskey on his breath. I've seen this kind of setup before. You're probably working with a gang of thieves who target servicemen. Other patrons were beginning to notice the new confrontation. Some of the sailors who had been fighting with the Marines just moments before now found themselves in the awkward position of potentially having to defend a woman from one of their former opponents. Sarah remained calm despite Rodriguez's increasing agitation. Sir, I'm going to ask you to step back. You're making a mistake. The only mistake, Rodriguez growled, is that you picked the wrong Marine to mess with tonight. He swung at her then, a wild haymaker that would have connected with devastating force if Sarah hadn't been ready for it. But She had been tracking his body language and saw the punch coming long before he threw it. She ducked under his fist and stepped to the side, causing him to overextend and stumble forward. "Don't do this," she warned him. "You're going to regret it." Rodriguez spun around, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. The other Marines were calling out to him, telling him to back off, but he was no longer listening to anyone. His pride had been wounded, and in his current state, that was unforgivable. "Die, bitch," he screamed, launching himself at her with both fists flying. Sarah's response was automatic and devastatingly effective. Years of training in close-quarters combat, combined with recent real-world experience in life-or-death situations, had honed her reflexes to a razor's edge. She caught his leading arm, used his momentum against him, and executed a perfect hip throw that sent all 240 pounds of angry Marine crashing to the floor with bone-jarring force. Rodriguez hit the wooden planks hard enough to drive the air from his lungs and leave him gasping like a fish out of water. Sarah stood over him, not even breathing hard, while the entire bar fell silent. Everyone had stopped what they were doing to stare at the woman who had just manhandled one of the toughest-looking men in the place. As Rodriguez struggled to catch his breath and understand what had just happened to him, Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out her military identification. She held it up for everyone to see, though most of the patrons were too far away to read the details. Rodriguez stared at Sarah's outstretched hand for a long moment before accepting it. As she helped him to his feet, he could feel the controlled strength in her grip, not aggressive, but unmistakably powerful. The bar remained eerily quiet as the gravity of what had just transpired settled over everyone present. Here was a Marine staff sergeant, a man who prided himself on being one of the toughest warriors in the military, who had just been effortlessly handled by a woman he had severely underestimated. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez muttered under his breath, brushing dirt and debris from his torn shirt. His ribs ached where he had hit the floor, and his pride was wounded even more than his body. But as the initial shock wore off, something else began to replace his embarrassment, a grudging respect for the woman who stood before him. Sarah could see the conflict playing out across his face. She had encountered this reaction before, particularly from male service members who discovered her true capabilities after making assumptions based on her appearance. Some became hostile and resentful, unable to accept that their preconceptions had been shattered. Others, like Rodriguez appeared to be doing, went through a process of rapid mental adjustment that usually led to professional respect. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice hoarse from the impact but carrying a note of genuine contrition, "I owe you an apology. I completely misread the situation." The other Marines gathered around them, their earlier bravado replaced by curiosity and a healthy dose of wariness. They had all heard of the SEALs, of course. Every service member knew about the Navy's elite Special Operations Forces. But actually encountering one in a bar fight was something none of them had expected. "Apology accepted," Sarah replied simply. "But you should know that those 3 men over there were genuinely harassing a young woman. I didn't start that confrontation. I ended it." Rodriguez looked over at the 3 civilians who were beginning to stir on the floor. The largest one was sitting up and holding his stomach, while the other 2 were slowly regaining consciousness. None of them appeared seriously injured, but they were clearly in no condition to continue causing trouble. "I should have asked questions before jumping to conclusions," Rodriguez admitted. "It's just, when I saw 3 guys down and you standing over them, I assumed." "You assumed that a woman couldn't have handled 3 men without help," Sarah finished for him. "It's a common mistake, but it's one that can get people hurt in situations like this." The bartender finally found his voice and began surveying the damage to his establishment. Tables were overturned, chairs were broken, and there was glass scattered across the floor from several broken bottles. The jukebox was silent, either damaged in the fight or simply unplugged. The man looked like he was calculating how much this evening was going to cost him. "All right, everybody out," he called out. "I'm calling the shore patrol, and I don't want to see any of you in here again tonight." The threat of military police arriving galvanized everyone into action. The various combatants began filing toward the exit, most of them avoiding eye contact with each other and hoping to avoid any official consequences for their involvement in the brawl. The three civilians were helped to their feet by some of the departing patrons and escorted outside, presumably to find somewhere else to nurse their wounded pride and aching bodies. Sarah was about to leave as well when Rodriguez approached her again. "Ma'am, if I could have a word with you outside, I'd like to understand what just happened here." Sarah considered this request for a moment. She was tired and had been looking forward to a quiet evening, but something in Rodriguez's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than continued hostility. And, truthfully, she was somewhat curious about him as well. It took a certain kind of character to acknowledge a mistake so publicly and immediately. 5 minutes, she agreed. They stepped outside into the humid Virginia night. The parking lot was still filled with departing patrons, most of whom were talking quietly among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Several people stared openly at Sarah as they passed, clearly trying to reconcile her appearance with what they had seen her do inside the bar. Rodriguez led her to a relatively quiet corner of the parking lot, away from the crowd. Up close, Sarah could see that he was probably in his late 20s, with the kind of weathered features that suggested extensive time spent outdoors in harsh conditions. His hands showed the calluses and small scars common to infantry Marines, and despite his earlier poor judgment, she could sense an underlying intelligence in his eyes. "I've been a Marine for 8 years, he began, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that hadn't been there in the bar. "I've served in Iraq and Afghanistan, done 2 deployments to each. I thought I knew what tough looked like." Sarah waited for him to continue, sensing that he needed to work through whatever was bothering him. "But what you did in there, I've never seen anything like it. You didn't even look like you were trying hard. How is that possible?" Sarah had fielded similar questions before, usually from fellow service members who were curious about SEAL training and capabilities. She had standard responses that satisfied most people's curiosity without revealing any classified information. "The training is intensive," she said carefully. "Selection alone takes over a year, and that's just to get to the starting point. After that, you spend years learning different skills, hand-to-hand combat, weapons, tactics, languages, whatever the mission requires." "But you're—" Rodriguez stopped himself, clearly struggling with how to phrase his question without causing offense. "A woman," Sarah finished with a slight smile. "Yes, I noticed that too. The Navy began allowing women in special operations roles a few years ago, though the integration process has been gradual." "How many women are there?" "In the SEALs, I mean." "That's classified information," Sarah replied. "But I can tell you that the standards haven't changed. Every SEAL has to meet the same physical and mental requirements, regardless of gender." Rodriguez nodded slowly, apparently processing this information. "I guess I always thought that, well, that physical strength was the most important factor." "It's important," Sarah acknowledged. "But it's not the only thing that matters. Speed, technique, intelligence, adaptability, those all count for a lot. Plus, there are different kinds of strength. What I lack in raw muscle mass compared to someone like you, I make up for in other areas." "Like what?" Sarah considered how much she wanted to reveal. "Flexibility, for one thing. I can get into positions and spaces that larger operators can't. I'm also faster than most men, and my reflexes test in the top percentile for reaction time. But, mostly, it's about using an opponent's strength against them rather than trying to match it directly." "Is that what you did to me? Used my strength against me?" "Partly. You were angry and drunk, which made you predictable. You telegraphed your intentions, overcommit to your attacks, and lost your balance easily. In a real combat situation, you'd be much more dangerous because you'd be thinking clearly." Rodriguez looked somewhat reassured by this assessment. "So you're saying that under different circumstances, the outcome might have been different?" Sarah shrugged. "Maybe, but probably not. I've been training for this kind of thing for a long time, and I've had real-world experience applying it. That's not something you can easily overcome, even with superior physical strength." They were interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance. The shore patrol was finally arriving to deal with the aftermath of the bar fight. Most of the other patrons had already left, not wanting to be around when the military police began asking questions and taking statements. "We should probably get out of here," Rodriguez suggested. "I don't really want to explain to my commanding officer why I was involved in a bar fight." Sarah nodded in agreement. She definitely didn't want to deal with the complications that would arise if her identity and presence became part of an official incident report. Her current assignment required a low profile, and being involved in a publicized altercation would raise questions she wasn't authorized to answer. "Staff Sergeant," she said as they prepared to part ways. "Can I give you some advice?" "Yes, ma'am. Your instinct to protect people is admirable, but next time, try to get the full story before you act. Assumptions can be dangerous, especially when they involve people you don't know or situations you don't fully understand." Rodriguez nodded seriously. "I'll remember that. And ma'am, thank you for not seriously hurting me in there. I get the feeling you could have if you'd wanted to." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "You're not a bad person, Rodriguez. You just made a mistake based on incomplete information. I've done the same thing myself more than once. The important thing is learning from it." They shook hands, and Sarah was pleased to note that Rodriguez's grip was firm but not aggressive, a sign of respect rather than an attempt to prove something. As they walked toward their respective vehicles, she reflected on how differently the evening had turned out from what she had expected. All she had wanted was a quiet drink and some time to decompress, but instead she had ended up in two separate confrontations and revealed her identity to a bar full of strangers. As she drove back toward the naval base, Sarah's phone began ringing. The caller ID showed a number she recognized, her commanding officer. Her heart sank as she realized that word of the evening's events had probably already reached official channels. "Mitchell," she answered. "Sarah, it's Commander Harrison. I just received an interesting phone call from the shore patrol. Something about an incident at a local bar involving a female SEAL." Sarah closed her eyes and pulled over to the side of the road. "Sir, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. My office, 0800 tomorrow." "And Sarah, next time you want to go out drinking, maybe choose a place that's not frequented by half the Marine Corps." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in frustration. She had thought she was being careful by choosing a random bar away from the main base areas, but apparently Murphy's Law applied even to carefully planned recreation time. As she resumed driving, her mind began working through the potential consequences of the evening's events. Her security clearance would definitely be reviewed, and there would probably be questions about whether her cover had been compromised. Worse, the incident would likely be used as ammunition by those in the military hierarchy who still questioned the wisdom of allowing women in special operations roles. But there were positive aspects to consider as well. She had successfully defused a dangerous situation involving a civilian woman without anyone being seriously injured. She had also managed to turn a potential enemy into someone who might actually become an advocate for female service members in combat roles. Rodriguez's reaction suggested that his preconceptions about women in the military had been fundamentally altered by their encounter. When she finally reached her quarters on base, Sarah sat in her car for a few minutes before going inside. The familiar surroundings of the naval facility provided a sense of security and purpose that had been missing during her time in the civilian bar. This was her world, a place where her skills and dedication were understood and valued, where her gender was less important than her ability to complete the mission. Her quarters were spartanly furnished, but comfortable, reflecting the practical mindset of someone who might be deployed anywhere in the world with minimal notice. She had learned not to become too attached to material possessions, since the nature of her work meant that permanence was largely an illusion. As she prepared for bed, Sarah's thoughts returned to Rodriguez, and the Oth Commander Harrison's office at 0800 sharp was exactly where Sarah found herself the next morning, standing at attention in her dress uniform. The commander was a 20-year Navy veteran with graying temples and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Behind his desk hung photographs from various deployments and commendations that spoke to a distinguished career in naval intelligence and special operations oversight. "At ease, Petty Officer Mitchell," Harrison said without looking up from the file open on his desk. Sarah could see that it was thick, much thicker than a standard personnel file, and she recognized some of the classification markings on the visible pages. "Please have a seat." Sarah settled into the chair across from his desk, maintaining perfect posture while trying to gauge his mood from his body language. Commander Harrison had always been fair in his dealings with her, but the circumstances of this meeting were far from ordinary. I've spent the last 2 hours on the phone with various officials, ranging from the Shore Patrol to the Pentagon. Harrison began, finally, closing the file and giving Sarah his full attention. The good news is that no one was seriously injured in last night's incident. The bad news is that your involvement has raised some concerns at levels far above my pay grade. Sir, I want to explain what happened. Harrison held up a hand. I've already read the Shore Patrol report and spoken with several witnesses, including Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. I have a clear picture of the events, and I want you to know that from an operational standpoint, you handled the situation appropriately. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she knew this conversation was far from over. However, Harrison continued, your decision to reveal your identity and unit affiliation in a public setting has created complications. The nature of your current assignment requires a level of operational security that may have been compromised. Sir, I felt it was necessary to de-escalate the situation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was operating under false assumptions about what had occurred, and revealing my credentials was the most efficient way to establish credibility and prevent further conflict. Harrison nodded slowly. I understand your reasoning, and under most circumstances, I would agree with your assessment. But your current assignment involves sensitive operations that require complete anonymity. The fact that your identity is now known to potentially dozens of witnesses creates security concerns that we have to address. Sarah had expected this conversation, but hearing it laid out so clearly still caused her stomach to clench. She loved her current assignment and the challenges it presented. The thought of being reassigned to less sensitive duties was deeply disappointing. What are my options, sir? That's still being determined. I've been in contact with Admiral Morrison's office, and they're conducting a security review to assess the potential damage. In the meantime, you're temporarily relieved of operational duties pending the outcome of that review. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Being temporarily relieved meant she would be essentially sidelined while bureaucrats and security officials decided whether her career in special operations could continue. She had seen other operators go through similar reviews, and the outcomes were rarely favorable. Sir, is there anything I can do to influence that review? Any way to demonstrate that my operational effectiveness hasn't been compromised? Harrison's expression softened slightly. Actually, there might be. I received an interesting phone call this morning from Colonel Martinez at the Marine base. It seems Staff Sergeant Rodriguez requested a meeting with his commanding officer to discuss last night's events. This was unexpected news, and Sarah wasn't sure whether it was positive or negative. What did he want to discuss? According to Colonel Martinez, Rodriguez wants to formally recommend you for some kind of commendation related to your intervention in the civilian assault situation. He also apparently gave a very detailed and favorable account of your conduct throughout the entire incident. Sarah was genuinely surprised. She had hoped that Rodriguez would learn something from their encounter, but she hadn't expected him to actively advocate for her with his superiors. There's more, Harrison continued. Rodriguez has also requested permission to attend a joint training exercise that would allow him to observe SEAL training methods. He specifically cited his encounter with you as motivation for wanting to learn more about your combat techniques. That's unusual, sir. Very unusual. In fact, it's given me an idea that might help resolve our current situation. Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more animated. The Pentagon has been pushing for increased inter-service cooperation and training exchanges. What if we could turn last night's incident into an opportunity for exactly that kind of program? Sarah wasn't sure where this was heading, but she could sense that Harrison was developing a plan that might benefit everyone involved. I'm thinking about proposing a pilot program where select SEAL personnel would provide specialized training to other service branches, focusing on hand-to-hand combat and close-quarters tactics. You would be an ideal instructor for such a program, and it would provide legitimate cover for your presence in various military communities. The idea was intriguing, and Sarah could see the potential benefits. It would allow her to continue using her skills while providing valuable training to other service members. It might also help break down some of the barriers and misconceptions that still existed between different branches of the military. Would this be instead of my current assignment, or in addition to it? That would depend on the security review. But If we can demonstrate that your exposure actually enhances your operational value rather than compromising it, we might be able to maintain your current clearance level while expanding your role. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Harrison called for the visitor to enter, and Sarah was surprised to see Staff Sergeant Rodriguez step into the office. He was in his dress uniform and appeared somewhat nervous about being in the presence of a Navy commander. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, thank you for coming," Harrison said, rising to greet him. "I believe you've already met Petty Officer Mitchell." "Yes, sir," Rodriguez replied, nodding respectfully to Sarah. "Ma'am, please have a seat." Harrison gestured to another chair. "Staff Sergeant, I understand you wanted to discuss last night's events?" Rodriguez straightened in his chair before responding. "Yes, sir. I wanted to make sure that Petty Officer Mitchell receives proper recognition for her actions last night. She prevented a serious assault and handled a very difficult situation with remarkable professionalism. That's very generous of you, especially considering that you were also involved in the altercation." Rodriguez's face flushed slightly. "Sir, I made some serious errors in judgment last night. I acted on assumptions rather than facts, and I allowed alcohol and adrenaline to cloud my thinking. Petty Officer Mitchell could have seriously injured me, but instead she chose to use only the minimum force necessary to end the confrontation." Sarah was impressed by his candor and willingness to accept responsibility for his mistakes. It took character to admit faults so openly, especially in front of superior officers. "I've also been thinking about what she said to me afterward," Rodriguez continued, "about the importance of understanding a situation before acting. It made me realize that there's a lot I don't know about other branches of the military and their capabilities." Harrison exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. "That's an interesting observation, Staff Sergeant. Are you saying you'd like to learn more about Navy Special Operations?" "Yes, sir, if that were possible. I've served with some outstanding Marines, but last night showed me that there are techniques and approaches that we could benefit from learning. I'd like to request permission to participate in any joint training exercises that might be available." This was developing exactly as Harrison had hoped, and Sarah could see him beginning to implement his plan. "As it happens, Staff Sergeant, we were just discussing the possibility of establishing a joint training program. Would you be interested in serving as a liaison to help develop such a program?" Rodriguez's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Absolutely, sir. I think there's tremendous value in cross-service training and education." "Excellent. Petty Officer Mitchell, what would you think about serving as a primary instructor for such a program? You'd be teaching hand-to-hand combat and close-quarters tactics to personnel from other service branches." Sarah could see the elegance of Harrison's solution. It would provide her with legitimate cover for her presence in various military communities while also addressing the Pentagon's desire for increased inter-service cooperation. More importantly, it might allow her to maintain her security clearance and continue her special operations career. "I would be honored to serve in that capacity, sir." "Outstanding. I'll begin drafting a proposal immediately." Harrison turned to Rodriguez. "Staff Sergeant, I'll need you to work with your chain of command to identify potential participants from the Marine Corps. We'll want to start with a small group of highly motivated personnel. I can have a list of candidates on your desk by the end of the week, sir." "Perfect. Petty Officer Mitchell, you'll be temporarily assigned to develop curriculum and training protocols while we wait for the security review to be completed. This will demonstrate to the reviewing officials that your exposure has actually enhanced your operational value." As the meeting concluded and Rodriguez prepared to leave, he approached Sarah with an expression of genuine respect. "Ma'am, I want to thank you again for last night. Not just for stopping me from making an even bigger fool of myself, but for taking the time to explain things afterward. I learned more in those 5 minutes than I had in months of regular training." "Just remember what we discussed about getting the full story before acting," Sarah replied. "That lesson applies to a lot more than bar fights." Rodriguez smiled and shook her hand firmly. "Yes, ma'am. I won't forget." After he left, Harrison and Sarah spent another hour discussing the details of the proposed training program. They would need to develop a comprehensive curriculum that covered not just physical techniques, but also tactical theory and decision-making under pressure. The goal would be to create a program that genuinely enhanced the capabilities of participants rather than simply going through the motions of inter-service cooperation. This could be the beginning of something significant, Harrison observed as they wrapped up their planning session. If we can demonstrate measurable improvements in participant performance, it could lead to a permanent program with expanded scope and resources. Sarah was beginning to feel genuinely excited about the possibilities. The program would allow her to share her knowledge and experience with a broader range of military personnel while potentially advancing her own career. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that had attracted her to special operations in the first place. Sir, what about the security review? How long will that process take? Typically 4 to 6 weeks, but given the circumstance 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in front of a specialized training facility at Joint Base Norfolk, watching 12 carefully selected military personnel file into what would become the first official session of the Inter-Service Combat Training Program. The group included Marines, Army Rangers, Air Force Security Forces, and even 2 Coast Guard personnel with law enforcement backgrounds. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been instrumental in selecting the Marine participants, ensuring that each one was genuinely committed to learning rather than simply proving themselves against a Navy SEAL. The facility itself was impressive, a purpose-built training center with padded floors, mirrored walls, and state-of-the-art equipment for demonstrating various combat techniques. Admiral Morrison had personally approved the budget for the program after reviewing Sarah's detailed curriculum proposal and Harrison's strategic justification for the initiative. "Good morning," Sarah addressed the assembled group, all of whom were in physical training uniforms and standing at attention. "I'm Petty Officer First Class Mitchell, and I'll be your primary instructor for this program. Before we begin, I want to establish some ground rules and explain exactly what we're trying to accomplish here." She could see the mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and determination on the faces before her. Several participants were clearly trying to reconcile her appearance with what they knew about her background and capabilities. Sarah had expected this reaction and was prepared to address it directly. "Some of you are probably wondering whether a woman can effectively teach combat techniques to a group that includes some of the military's most elite warriors. That's a fair question, and I'm going to answer it by demonstrating rather than explaining." Sarah gestured to Rodriguez, who stepped forward with a slight grin. Over the past 3 weeks, they had developed a professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the program's success. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, would you please attack me as if I were an enemy combatant threatening your unit?" Rodriguez nodded and assumed a combat stance. The other participants formed a semicircle around them, watching intently as the Marine launched a coordinated assault that combined striking techniques with grappling attempts. His movements were skilled and aggressive, representing years of training and combat experience. Sarah's response was fluid and efficient. She deflected his strikes, redirected his energy, and used leverage to neutralize his advantages in size and strength. Within 30 seconds, Rodriguez was on the ground in a submission hold that would have rendered him unconscious if Sarah had applied full pressure. "Excellent work, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said as she helped him to his feet. "Now, who can tell me what they observed during that demonstration?" A Army Ranger raised her hand. "You used his momentum against him instead of trying to match his strength directly." "Correct. What else?" "You stayed calm and controlled throughout the encounter," observed an Air Force Security Forces sergeant. "You didn't seem to be exerting much effort." "Also correct. The key to effective close-quarters combat isn't brute force. It's understanding physics, anatomy, and psychology. Over the next 6 weeks, you're going to learn techniques that will make you more effective fighters regardless of your size or gender." Sarah spent the rest of the morning covering basic principles of leverage, balance, and anatomical vulnerabilities. She demonstrated how proper technique could allow a smaller defender to overcome larger attackers, using volunteers from the group to illustrate each point. By lunch break, even the most skeptical participants were beginning to understand the value of what they were learning. During the lunch break, Rodriguez approached Sarah with an expression of professional concern. "Ma'am, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. There's been some talk among Marine leadership about this program, and not all of it is positive." Sarah had expected some resistance from traditionalists who questioned the value of inter-service training or the appropriateness of female instructors. What kind of talk? Some senior NCOs are saying this is just political correctness run amok, that the Navy is trying to prove a point about women in combat roles rather than actually improving our capabilities. They're watching for any excuse to claim the program isn't effective. This information was concerning, but not entirely surprising. Sarah had encountered similar attitudes throughout her career, and she knew that the success of this program would be measured by stricter standards than might be applied to similar initiatives led by male instructors. Are any of the participants in this session expressing those concerns? Not directly, but I can tell that a couple of them are still skeptical. They're participating because they were ordered to, not because they believe in what we're doing. Sarah appreciated Rodriguez's honesty and his willingness to share information that could help her address potential problems before they became serious issues. Do you have suggestions for how to handle that? From what I've seen so far, you're doing exactly the right thing. Focus on practical techniques that work, demonstrate everything you teach, and let the results speak for themselves. These are all experienced fighters. They'll recognize effective training when they see it. The afternoon session focused on defensive techniques against armed attackers. Sarah introduced concepts from Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and traditional military combatives, emphasizing adaptability and situational awareness. She had each participant practice disarming techniques against rubber knives and training pistols, providing individual coaching to help them understand the principles behind each movement. One of the Coast Guard participants, a petty officer named Johnson, was struggling with the knife defense techniques. He was a large man with a background in maritime law enforcement, but his movements were too rigid and predictable. Petty Officer Johnson, you're treating this like a choreographed dance, Sarah observed. In a real situation, your attacker won't move exactly the way we've practiced. You need to understand the principle and adapt to circumstances. She demonstrated the technique again, this time having Rodriguez vary his attack angle and timing. See how I adjust my response based on what he's actually doing, not what I expect him to do. That's the difference between memorizing moves and understanding combat. Johnson nodded and tried the technique again, this time with more fluid and responsive movement. The improvement was immediate and obvious to everyone watching. By the end of the first week, word about the program had begun to spread throughout the military community. Commander Harrison reported that he was fielding inquiries from other units interested in participating, and Admiral Morrison was receiving positive feedback from Pentagon officials who had been briefed on the initiative. More importantly for Sarah, the participants were showing measurable improvement in their abilities. She had established baseline assessments for each individual and was documenting their progress through standardized testing protocols. The data would be crucial for justifying the program's continuation and expansion. The second week brought new challenges as Sarah introduced more complex scenarios involving multiple attackers and environmental obstacles. She had set up training areas that simulated real-world conditions, narrow corridors, staircases, confined spaces where traditional fighting techniques might not be applicable. Combat doesn't happen in a sterile environment like this training room, she explained to the group. You might be fighting in a ship's passageway, a building stairwell, or the back seat of a vehicle. You need to be able to adapt your techniques to whatever space you find yourself in. She demonstrated how to use walls, furniture, and even other people as tactical advantages rather than obstacles. The participants practiced fighting in complete darkness, with simulated injuries, and while wearing full combat gear that restricted their movement. Rodriguez was proving to be an invaluable assistant instructor, helping to demonstrate techniques and providing insights from his own combat experience. His enthusiastic participation was also helping to legitimize the program among skeptical Marines who respected his judgment and combat record. During the third week, Sarah received news that the security review of her clearance status had been completed. Commander Harrison called her into his office with an expression that she couldn't quite read. The review board has reached their decision, he announced without preamble. Your security clearance has been maintained at its current level, and you've been cleared to return to operational duties. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. That's excellent news, sir. There's more. Based on the preliminary results from your training program, Admiral Morrison has requested that you continue developing the curriculum while maintaining your operational responsibilities. You're being promoted to Chief Petty Officer, effective immediately. The promotion was unexpected and deeply gratifying. It represented not just recognition of her individual achievements, but also validation of the program she had developed. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I know you won't. And Sarah? The Admiral specifically mentioned that your ability to turn a potentially negative incident into a career-enhancing opportunity demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking the Navy needs from its special operations personnel. The fourth week of the program brought the most challenging scenarios yet. Sarah introduced force-on-force exercises where participants had to apply everything they had learned in dynamic situations against fully resisting opponents. These exercises revealed not just technical proficiency, but also decision-making under pressure and the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. She was particularly impressed by the progress shown by all 12 participants. Even those who had initially been skeptical were now enthusiastic advocates for the training methods. More importantly, their improvement was measurable and significant. Reaction times had improved, technique execution was more precise, and their confidence in close-quarters situations had increased dramatically. During one particularly intense exercise, Johnson found himself facing 3 opponents simultaneously in a confined space. Using techniques he had learned in the program, he successfully neutralized all 3 attackers without sustaining significant damage himself. 6 weeks earlier, such a scenario would have been nearly impossible for him to handle effectively. Outstanding work, Petty Officer Johnson, Sarah called out as the exercise concluded. You've come a long way from our first day. Johnson grinned as he helped his opponents to their feet. Ma'am, I have to admit I was skeptical about learning from someone half my size. But these techniques actually work better than anything I've learned before. His comment prompted approving nods from the other participants, including some who had initially been among the most doubtful about the program's value. The success of the pilot program was becoming impossible to ignore, even among those who had initially opposed it. Colonel Martinez visited the training facility to observe one of the sessions and left visibly impressed by what he witnessed. He immediately requested that additional Marines be included in future iterations of the program. Similar requests began arriving from other units and installations. The program that had begun as a solution to Sarah's exposure problem was rapidly evolving into something much larger and more significant. By the end of the 4th week, Harrison was fielding inquiries from international military partners interested in sending 6 months after the Murphy's Bar incident. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell stood on the podium at the Pentagon briefing room, addressing a gathering of senior military officials from all service branches. The inter-service combat training program had exceeded every expectation and performance metric established during its pilot phase. What had begun as a solution to a security concern had evolved into one of the military's most successful cross-training initiatives. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, her voice carrying confidently through the large room. The data clearly demonstrates that participants in our program show an average 37% improvement in close-quarters combat effectiveness, with some individuals achieving improvements of over 60%. She clicked to the next slide, which displayed detailed statistics from the past 6 months of training cycles. More significantly, we've documented a measurable increase in inter-service cooperation and understanding. Participants report improved confidence in their ability to work effectively with personnel from other branches, and command evaluations show enhanced tactical flexibility in joint operations. Admiral Morrison, who was seated in the front row, nodded approvingly as Sarah continued her presentation. The program had become one of his signature initiatives, and its success was reflecting positively on his leadership of Naval Special Operations. The program has now trained over 200 personnel from all service branches, including international participants from allied nations. We've established permanent training facilities at 3 locations, with plans for expansion to 2 additional sites within the next fiscal year. Sarah paused to take a sip of water and scan the audience. She could see Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now promoted to Gunnery Sergeant, sitting with other Marine representatives. Their professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Rodriguez had become the program's primary Marine liaison and had been instrumental in developing specialized curricula for different military occupational specialties. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah continued, we've received reports from operational units indicating that program graduates are applying their training effectively in real-world situations. Over the past 4 months, we've documented 17 instances where personnel credited their program training with mission success or personal survival in combat situations. This was the statistic that mattered most to Sarah. Academic improvements and test scores were valuable, but knowing that her instruction had literally saved lives in the field provided a level of satisfaction that no promotion or commendation could match. General Patricia Williams, the Army's representative on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised her hand. Chief Mitchell, what are the program's current capacity limitations, and how are you addressing the increasing demand for training slots? Excellent question, ma'am. Current capacity is limited primarily by instructor availability rather than facilities or equipment. We're addressing this through a train-the-trainer program that will certify qualified personnel from each service branch to conduct program instruction at their home installations. Sarah clicked to another slide showing the proposed instructor certification curriculum. The goal is to maintain consistent quality and standards while dramatically expanding our training capacity. We estimate that within 18 months, we'll be able to train over 1,000 personnel annually while maintaining our current effectiveness metrics. Colonel James Patterson, representing Air Force Special Operations Command, leaned forward in his chair. Chief, there have been some informal discussions about adapting this program for law enforcement applications. Have you given any consideration to civilian applications? This was a question Sarah had been expecting. Several federal agencies had expressed interest in the program, and there were obvious applications for police and security personnel. Sir, we've received inquiries from multiple civilian agencies, and there's definitely potential for adaptation. However, our current focus is on maximizing military effectiveness and ensuring we can meet service demands before expanding into civilian markets. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, with Sarah fielding questions about everything from budget requirements to international partnerships. When it concluded, she was surrounded by officials wanting to discuss specific aspects of the program or arrange visits to training facilities. Admiral Morrison approached her as the crowd began to thin. Outstanding presentation, Chief. I've been asked to inform you that the Secretary of Defense is personally interested in the program's development. There's discussion about incorporating similar training methodologies into basic military education curricula. This was news that went beyond Sarah's wildest expectations. The possibility of influencing how all military personnel were trained represented an opportunity to make a lasting impact on military effectiveness and readiness. Sir, I'm honored by the Secretary's interest. How can I best support those discussions? Continue doing exactly what you've been doing. The results speak for themselves, and your leadership has been exemplary throughout this entire process. As the Pentagon meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to return to Norfolk, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. The incident at Murphy's Bar, which had initially seemed like such a disaster, had ultimately provided the catalyst for the most rewarding period of her career. Her phone rang as she walked through the Pentagon corridors toward the exit. The caller ID showed Rodriguez's number. Gunny, what's the word? She answered. Chief, I just wanted to let you know that the next group of Marine participants includes some personnel who were specifically requesting assignment based on recommendations from previous graduates. Word is spreading that this training actually works. This was exactly the kind of organic growth that indicated genuine program success. When warriors recommended training to their peers, it carried more weight than any official endorsement. That's outstanding news. Are you still planning to attend the instructor certification course next month? Wouldn't miss it. I've got approval to establish a permanent training site at Quantico, and I need to be fully certified before we start accepting students there. The expansion to Quantico represented a major milestone for the program. Having a permanent presence at the Marine Corps' primary training installation would provide access to a much larger population of potential participants and would further legitimize the program within Marine culture. Excellent. I'll see you in Norfolk next month for the certification course. As Sarah ended the call and continued toward her car, she encountered an unexpected figure waiting near the Pentagon's main entrance. It was Jessica, the young woman she had helped at Murphy's Bar 6 months earlier. Sarah almost didn't recognize her in professional attire, but the recognition was mutual. "Excuse me, Chief Mitchell?" Jessica approached somewhat hesitantly. "I don't know if you remember me, but you helped me at a bar in Virginia Beach several months ago." Sarah was genuinely surprised to encounter Jessica in this setting. "Of course I remember you. What are you doing at the Pentagon?" "I work here now, actually. I'm a civilian analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency. I've been following the news about your training program, and I wanted to thank you again for what you did that night." This unexpected encounter provided a perfect reminder of why the incident at Murphy's Bar had been worth all the complications it had caused. Sarah's intervention had protected an innocent person from potential harm, and that remained the most important outcome regardless of what had followed. "I'm just glad you weren't seriously hurt that night. How are you doing now?" "Much better, thank you. That experience actually motivated me to take self-defense classes, and eventually led to my interest in military affairs and my current position here. In a way, that awful night changed my life for the better." They talked for a few more minutes about Jessica's career path and her work at the Pentagon. As they prepared to part ways, Jessica had one final comment. "Chief, I hope you know that what you've accomplished with this training program is amazing. You've turned your skills into something that's helping so many people. That says a lot about your character." As Sarah drove back to Norfolk, she considered Jessica's words and their deeper meaning. Military service had always been about more than personal achievement or career advancement. It was about using individual skills and dedication to contribute to something larger and more important than oneself. The training program had evolved into exactly that kind of contribution. Every person who graduated from the program carried enhanced capabilities that could protect their fellow service members and contribute to mission success. The ripple effects would extend far beyond what could be measured or documented. When Sarah arrived back at her quarters that evening, she found a message waiting from Commander Harrison requesting a meeting the following morning. The tone suggested good news, and her speculation was confirmed when she met with him the next day. "Sarah, I have some exciting news," Harrison began without preamble. "You've been selected for the Advanced Strategic Studies program at the Naval War College. It's a year-long program that prepares senior personnel for major command responsibilities. This was one of the most prestigious educational opportunities available to naval personnel, typically reserved for officers being groomed for the highest levels of leadership. The fact that she was being considered as an enlisted person was extraordinary. "Sir, I'm honored by the selection, but what would happen to the training program during my absence?" "That's been carefully considered. Rodriguez and the other certified instructors would maintain operational continuity, and you would remain involved in strategic planning and curriculum development through distance learning and periodic visits. The program is now sufficiently established that it can function effectively with distributed leadership." The War College opportunity represented the next phase of Sarah's career development, preparing her for responsibilities that would extend far beyond her current role. It would also provide opportunities to influence military education and training at the highest policy levels. When would the program begin? "Next fall. That gives you several months to complete the instructor certification program, establish the new training sites, and ensure smooth transition of day-to-day operations." As Sarah left Harrison's office that morning, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that night at Murphy's Bar. What had begun as a simple desire for a quiet drink had ultimately led to career opportunities she had never imagined possible. More importantly, it had demonstrated that even the most challenging situations could lead to positive outcomes if approached with the right combination of skill, professionalism, and integrity. The confrontation with Rodriguez had taught both of them valuable lessons about assumptions, respect, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances. The training program that had emerged from that incident was now touching hundreds of lives and enhancing military readiness in measurable ways. It represented the best kind of leadership, using personal expertise and experience to empower others and contribute to shared goals. As Sarah began planning for the final phases of the program's expansion and her own transition to the War College, she carried with her a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. The journey from that chaotic night in a dive bar to a Pentagon briefing room had been unexpected and sometimes challenging, but it had ultimately led to exactly where she was meant to be. The future held new challenges and opportunities, but Sarah approached them with confidence gained through experience and the knowledge that even the most difficult situations could be transformed into something positive through determination, skill, and the willingness to see beyond immediate obstacles to longer-term possibilities. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been wrong about many things that night at Murphy's bar, but he had been absolutely right about one thing. Sarah Mitchell was indeed someone you didn't want to underestimate. The difference was that her strength came not just from physical capability, but from the character and intelligence to use that capability in service of something greater than herself. Personnel to participate. This has grown beyond what any of us initially envisioned, Harrison told Sarah during one of their regular progress reviews. Admiral Morrison is talking about making this a permanent program with a dedicated facility and staff. Sarah was thrilled by the possibilities, but also somewhat concerned about the responsibilities that would come with such expansion. Sir, would I be expected to leave operational duties to focus solely on training? That's still being determined. The ideal scenario would be maintaining your operational role while overseeing the training program's development. It would require some innovative scheduling, but it's definitely possible. As the program entered its final week, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that night at Murphy's bar. What had initially seemed like a career-ending mistake had instead opened doors to opportunities she had never imagined. The incident with Rodriguez had demonstrated that even the most challenging confrontations could lead to positive outcomes if handled with the right combination of skill, professionalism, and wisdom. More importantly, the program was genuinely improving the capabilities of military personnel from multiple service branches. The techniques and principles being taught would ultimately save lives and enhance mission effectiveness in real-world situations. That knowledge provided a sense of purpose and satisfaction that went beyond personal career advancements, and our proposed solution, I expect it to be expedited. Admiral Morrison seems intrigued by our training program concept, which is a positive sign. As Sarah left Commander Harrison's office, she reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in the span of a few hours. What had initially appeared to be a career-ending incident had potentially evolved into a career-enhancing opportunity. The key had been finding a way to turn her exposure into an asset rather than a liability. The next few weeks would be critical for establishing the training program and demonstrating its value to military leadership. Sarah was confident in her abilities as an instructor, but she also knew that the success of the program would depend on her ability to work effectively with personnel from different service branches who might have preconceptions about female instructors or Navy SEALs in general. Her encounter with Rodriguez had shown her that those preconceptions could be overcome through demonstration and honest dialogue. The challenge would be scaling that personal interaction to a formal training environment where the stakes were higher and the scrutiny more intense. But for the first time since leaving the bar the previous evening, Sarah felt optimistic about her future. The path forward might be different from what she had originally planned, but it offered opportunities for growth and impact that she hadn't previously considered. Sometimes the best outcomes emerge from the most unexpected circumstances, and last night's bar fight might ultimately prove to be one of those pivotal moments that redirected her career in a positive direction. Marines she had encountered. They represented the vast majority of military personnel, dedicated, patriotic individuals who were willing to put their lives on the line for their country. Their initial reaction to her capabilities had been surprise and skepticism, but that was understandable given their limited exposure to female special operations personnel. The real test would come in the morning when she faced Commander Harrison and whatever consequences had resulted from the evening's events. She had faith in her chain of command support, but she also knew that incidents like this could have implications beyond her individual career. Every female service member in a non-traditional role carried the additional burden of representing all women in the military, fair or not. Sarah set her alarm and tried to put the evening's events out of her mind. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and she would face them with the same professionalism and competence that had carried her through every other obstacle in her career. Whatever happened, she was confident that she had acted appropriately given the circumstances, and that confidence would have to be enough. As she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was a hope that Rodriguez would remember their conversation and perhaps share a more nuanced perspective about women in the military with his fellow Marines. Change often happened one person at a time, and tonight might have been the beginning of a small but meaningful shift in attitude for at least one Marine Staff Sergeant. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, she said, having read his name tape during their brief encounter. My name is Petty Officer First Class Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy SEALs. The silence in the bar became even more profound, if that were possible. Rodriguez's eyes widened as the implications of what she had just said began to penetrate his alcohol-fogged brain. A Navy SEAL. Not just any sailor, but one of the most elite special operations forces in the world. Special Operations Command, she continued, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. I'm currently assigned to a classified unit that I can't discuss, but I can tell you that what you just experienced is basic hand-to-hand combat training that every SEAL receives. Rodriguez was still on the floor, propped up on his elbows, and staring at her in shock. The other Marines looked equally stunned, while the sailors who had been fighting them just minutes before were grinning with obvious satisfaction. Now, Sarah said, extending her hand to help Rodriguez to his feet. I think we can all agree that this has been a learning experience for everyone involved.